All right, let's dive right into this explainer. We're going to be looking at the incredibly messy, super high-stakes birth of the American government. We often picture the United States just springing into existence fully formed, right when the British surrendered. But the reality? Oh, it was way more chaotic than that. We're talking about an era defined by intense compromise, bitter rivalries, and this very real, very terrifying fear that this whole grand experiment in democracy might just crash and burn before it even really got started.
To really set the stage, let's look at how George Washington himself described this newly independent nation. He called it a half-starved, limping government, always moving upon crutches. I mean, wow, right? After fighting this grueling, brutal war for independence, the leaders of the 13 states suddenly looked around and realized they were trying to manage a country with absolutely zero functional central authority. The system was literally on life support. And Washington? He knew that if they didn't pivot quickly, the entire nation was going to completely collapse.
So here's our roadmap for this explainer. We're going to cover, first, that limping government. Second, the push for a new constitution. Third, Washington and the very first political factions. And finally, testing this brand new republic.
Okay, jumping into Section 1, a half-starved, limping government.
So the Articles of Confederation, they created a central government that was so incredibly weak, it was basically bankrupt. It couldn't even guarantee that its own war veterans would get paid. It was this super loose confederation where every single state, no matter how big or small, got exactly one vote in a one-house Congress. There was no president to actually make decisions, no national courts to settle disputes. Imagine this. Congress could nicely ask the states for tax money, but they couldn't actually force anyone to pay up. They could raise an army, sure, but they had absolutely no power to draft soldiers to fill it. Basically, they were handed all the responsibility of running a country with absolutely none of the power to actually do it.
Now, despite all those massive, glaring failures, they actually did manage to pull off one brilliant success: westward expansion. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 set up this really specific three-stage process for turning newly acquired land into actual states. It went like this. Step 1, Congress appoints a governor. Step 2, once a territory hits 5,000 adult males, boom, they get to create their own legislature. And Step 3, once the free population reaches 60,000, they can officially apply for statehood. It was this highly orderly system that, amazingly, actually banned slavery in those new territories. This whole process literally set the blueprint for exactly how the country was going to grow.
But that financial crisis I mentioned earlier, it didn't just go away, it boiled right over. You had these angry farmers and military veterans who were just drowning in debt, and the banks were demanding hard cash. This all led to Shays' Rebellion. When the legislature totally ignored their pleas to just let them pay taxes and crops, Daniel Shays stepped up and led a full-blown revolt. And here's the truly terrifying part for the nation's leaders. It wasn't even the rebellion itself. It was the fact that the National Congress had absolutely no power and no money to send troops to stop it. Ultimately, Massachusetts had to independently raise thousands of militiamen just to finally scatter the uprising. It was a massive wake-up call.
Which brings us to Section 2, Compromise and a New Constitution.
Realizing the Articles of Confederation were completely beyond saving, 55 men locked themselves in a room in Philadelphia to build a brand new foundation. But almost immediately, the whole convention hit a massive brick wall over representation. You had the Virginia Plan, right? This was pushed by the big states, and they wanted a two-house legislature based entirely on population. Basically, more people equals more power. But the smaller states were having none of it. They fired back with the New Jersey Plan, demanding a single house where every state got exactly one equal vote. Guys, this grand experiment literally almost died right there on the convention floor. Thankfully, Roger Sherman stepped in with a great compromise, creating a House of Representatives based on population and a Senate where everyone gets equal representation. Crisis averted. For the moment.
We also really have to acknowledge the much darker reality of these negotiations, the 3/5 compromise. See, once representation in the House was tied to population size, a massive, bitter debate erupted over whether or not enslaved people should be counted. The southern states, where enslaved people actually made up about 40% of the population, they flat out refused to even discuss ending slavery. To make sure the South didn't just walk out of the room and abandon the whole project, the delegates struck a chilling mathematical deal. For the census, they agreed to count 3 people for every 5 slaves owned. This compromise drastically boosted Southern political influence in the new government for decades to come.
So drafting the Constitution was really only half the battle. Now they had to go out and sell this thing to a highly skeptical public.
On one side, you've got the Federalists. They're arguing that a strong central government is absolutely essential if the country is going to survive, and they wrote these 85 massive essays. The Federalist Papers just to prove their point. But on the other side, the anti-Federalists pushed back hard. They were totally terrified that this new system was just going to trample states' rights and essentially become a new monarchy. To win them over, the Federalists had to make one final, absolutely massive concession, a rock-solid promise to immediately add a Bill of Rights to put clear, strict limits on federal power.
All right, moving right along to Section 3, Washington and the First Factions. With the Constitution fully ratified and the Bill of Rights promised, the entire country basically turned to exactly one guy to be the lead architect of this brand new machine. In complete, stark contrast to all the fierce divisions raging across the country, George Washington received a unanimous 69 Electoral College votes. I mean, nobody else even came close. He was actually pretty reluctant to take the job. He really just wanted to retire to his farm at Mount Vernon, but he famously noted he was summoned by his country. So John Adams steps in as vice president, and this brand new government officially sets up its very first capital in New York City.
But, as you can probably guess, that beautiful unity fractured almost immediately. And ironically, the two-party system was born right there inside Washington's own cabinet. See, Washington absolutely despised the idea of political parties, but he essentially created them by hiring two brilliant guys who completely fundamentally disagreed on what America should even be. On one side, Alexander Hamilton led the Federalists. He wanted a powerful, centralized government focused on commercial development, banking, and big industry. On the exact opposite side, Thomas Jefferson led the newly formed Republican Party. He envisioned a totally different nation, a nation of small, independent farmers where power was kept strictly at the local and state levels.
This rivalry led to some intense backroom horse trading. To get his sweeping financial system passed, Hamilton had to strike what's known as the Compromise of 1790. Hamilton desperately needed Congress to pass his financial plan to get the country out of the red. But the southern states? They fiercely opposed it, mostly because they had way less war debt than the northern states, so they hatched a secret deal. The South agreed to let Hamilton's massive financial system pass, and in exchange, the permanent capital of the United States would be carved right out of the Potomac River, placing the ultimate seat of federal power squarely in the agrarian South.
Now for our final section, Section 4. Testing the Federal Republic.
So the new government had somehow survived being drafted, it survived ratification, and it was muddling through its first political rivalries. But honestly, none of that mattered even a little bit if regular citizens decided to just ignore the new laws. Under Hamilton's new financial system, the national government assumed all the state's debts and created a brand new national bank. But to pay for all of this, the government desperately needed revenue, so they decided to institute excise taxes on a few specific goods. And the absolute most controversial one of all, a federal tax on grain alcohol.
Well, that tax went over about as well as you'd expect. In 1794, angry farmers out in western Pennsylvania flat out refused to pay it. They started attacking tax collectors, tarring and feathering people, burning down barns. This whole chaotic mess became known as the Whiskey Rebellion. To these frontier farmers, whiskey wasn't just a fun drink for the weekend, it was how they preserved their excess grain, and honestly, they even used it as currency. They felt completely targeted by this distant, out-of-touch national government, very much like the rebels in Shays' Rebellion did just a few years prior. The violence escalated fast, and suddenly, this brand new constitution was staring down its very first major domestic revolt.
But here is where we see a massive difference. Remember the old, weak government's pathetic response to Shays' Rebellion? Well, Washington handled this one completely differently. He crushed the uprising by sending in 13,000 fully armed militiamen. Just think about that contrast for a second. Under the old Articles of Confederation, the government couldn't even manage to scrape together a few troops to protect its own courthouses. Now, President Washington is personally calling up an overwhelming force of 13,000 soldiers. It was a massive, undeniable show of force that scattered the rebels almost instantly, and thankfully, without major bloodshed. It sent a loud, crystal-clear message to the entire country. The United States government was real, it was powerful, and it absolutely had the means to enforce its laws.
So, as we wrap up and look back at this totally chaotic, compromise-filled birth of the United States, we really have to ask ourselves how much of our modern political landscape is still being shaped by these exact same arguments. Think about it. The intense debates over state versus federal power, the stark urban-rural divide,
the fierce rivalries of a deeply entrenched two-party system. None of these are new problems. They are literally the exact same stress points that Washington, Hamilton, and Jefferson were tearing their hair out over in the 1790s. The system they built through those intense boardroom battles and street-level rebellions was purposely designed to bend, to compromise, and ultimately to endure. So the question I want to leave you with today is this. As we navigate our own modern crises right now, are we just fighting the very same battles that defined the birth of the Republic?